Another psychological theory, the catharsis theory, also a pretty interesting theory that tries to explain how culture affects human psychology or our state of mind. The term catharsis was used by Aristotle to explain the effect that tragic dramas have on people. So in ancient Greece, for example, dramas were considered high art. They were considered noble culture, right? And comedies were not considered such. Hence this idea of catharsis, this term of catharsis coined by Aristotle, the idea that when you watch this high art, something dramatic like a really dramatic theater play, it has a very serious effect on people. And the effect is such that it clears people's minds by letting them release all their negative emotions. And that's the idea of catharsis is partially what contributed to the understanding of ancient drama as high art. So the idea there was that when you watch a comedy, you don't experience catharsis because you don't feel this suffering or this sort of dissonance. But when you experience negative emotion by watching something dramatic or serious, let's say like an ancient war drama theater play, you experience negative emotions and you sympathize with the characters. So you almost suffer with them as they go through all those obstacles on stage. And that leads you to this feeling of catharsis when you release all your negativity and all your negative emotions. That's a pretty specific idea, and it might not be that relevant to modern art unless we translate it to catharsis theory, which applies this original ancient term of catharsis to something a little bit more up to date. And what is it? We'll see on the next slide. So, catharsis theory employs this term created by Aristotle, the term of catharsis, and states that, for example, by playing violent video games and observing violence on the TV screen, people actually let go of their negative emotions and they don't experience that suffering in real life. So, for example, when you watch a war drama and you see great suffering on the screen, it makes you release your negative emotions rather than build them up. That's a pretty interesting theory, but again, whether we can support it with empirical evidence through research is a different question. Moving on to the next slide. Sociological theories, a group of theories very close to psychological theories. The major difference here is that psychological theories examine the effect of culture and mass media on each individual. Individually, how does it make you feel? When you see a movie, do you feel sad? Do you feel happy? Does it make you feel hopeful? Does it make you feel desperate? It's your own personal individual experience. So psychological theories are trying to examine the effect of mass media and culture on one particular individual, each one of us. But sociological theories treat human society as a whole. So they have this more holistic approach. They try to understand how mass media affect the whole human society. What kind of effect mass media and culture have on people, but not individually, but as a whole, as a social structure. So moving on to the next one. A couple names here. We already mentioned Lazarsfeld, which disagreed with the hypodermic needle theory. Scholars like George Gerbner and Lazarsfeld actually had a very different view on how violence in pop culture reflects on the human society, and they had this sociological approach. The basic idea here is that violence in pop culture doesn't threaten status quo, but rather cultivates traditional perceptions of what's good or bad. So films and video games that warn people through the scenes of violence, they usually have some kind of morality in the plot. So for example, if you watch a war movie about World War II, it usually has some kind of patriotic message in it, or a message that clearly distinguishes between good and bad. Or the movies about different historic periods that show great suffering that people went through historically. Again, they usually clearly distinguish between what's good and what's bad, what kind of what lessons we can learn from history. So the basic idea here is that from a sociological point of view, scholars like Gerbner and Lazarsfeld did not criticize violence in pop culture, specifically in film, because violence in pop culture, in their opinion, didn't really threaten the current society. It had no threat in it. It didn't make people violent, but rather, it actually just made it clear for people what's good and what's bad. And again, whether there is a way to find empirical evidence for that hypothesis, that's a whole different conversation that the scholars have been trying to answer throughout decades. Moving on to the next slide. Another theory here, sociological theory. One of the scholars that was at the very beginning of its history is Elihu Katz, and the theory is called uses and gratifications theory. This one is actually pretty popular, and you can see a lot of semi-modern studies still that are based on this theory. This is a dramatically different theory. It differs from the vast majority of all the theories that we discussed this week, and the reason why is because it completely reverses the angle and looks at mass media and culture in a completely different way. So if you've noticed, most of the theories that we discussed, they essentially aim to answer one question. What do mass media do to people or to the society? But overall, it was a one-way relationship. Mass media affect people or the society. Uses and gratifications theory is doing exactly the opposite. They're trying, these studies try to answer the question of what people do to mass media. In other words, media don't do anything to people, but rather people use media for their own purposes and gratifications. And that's the major idea of the uses and gratifications theory, and that's why it's so dramatically different from the vast majority of mass communication and cultural theories. Moving on to the next slide. A couple of terms that you can often see in cultural studies. One term is alienation, and that's a concept used by sociologists. That's why I included it in the conversation about sociological theories. This term describes the feeling of being disconnected from the society or disconnected from one's own feelings or blocking a person's feelings. Emil Durkheim, for example, used the term enemy to refer to the sense of purposelessness caused that is causing the loss of moral values and religious traditions. And this idea of alienation is somewhat close to this term, even though they're not used interchangeably. So the basic idea here is that mass media sometimes can alienate people, not just from the society, let's say, or from common values, but from our own selves. And that's one of the negative effects of mass media and pop culture on the society as a whole, because we have this whole problem of alienation, right? So sometimes you can see this term in cultural studies or in mass communication studies. But again, there's been a lot of attempts to figure out and find empirical evidence to support the idea that mass media can cause alienation. Or, super relevant example, do social media cause alienation? There's been a lot of conversation about that in the media, and people have been wondering, when we're so interconnected, let's say on Facebook or Twitter, does it make us feel more alienated in real life? Does it make us feel disconnected from the society that we're a part of? And that's what this term has been used for in mass comm and cultural research. And moving on to the next slide. So that's a whole new group of theories, semiotic theories, and they use a completely different idea behind them to use as a starting point in research on pop culture and specifically how mass media interact with pop culture or transmit pop culture. So the word semiotics, what does that mean? That's the study of signs and symbols and their use or interpretation. So semiotics as a field is attempting to find symbols in human culture and interpret them in a certain way. And of course, there's a lot of powerful symbols in the history of human culture. For example, the cross. That's a Christian symbol, right? We all know that. So that's a very powerful symbol that goes through the centuries, and it had a very significant effect on the cultural development of a lot of countries. And we still use this symbol in modern culture. You can see it a lot around. So the cross as a symbol, of course, it's not just a cross. It has the whole Christian philosophy behind it, the whole religious tradition behind it. And that's one example of a symbol that's very highly recognized. in that sense that a lot of people know what it is and what it stands for. One scholar, Roland Barthes, he is a French semiotician that explained that pop culture is an extension of folklore or mythological culture with its traditional narratives, such as good versus evil, hero versus villain. And it's a pretty interesting semiotic interpretation of modern culture, because if you look at some of the most modern examples from the world of pop culture, like superhero movies, you can see the dichotomy between good and evil, or hero versus villain. So this semiotic interpretation works pretty well for explaining some of the cultural phenomena, but not all of them. With that, we'll move on to the next slide. We'll elaborate a little bit on how mythological plots contribute to our understanding, or at least to the understanding of semiotic scholars, of what's going on in modern culture. So actually a lot of scholars have been noticing, a lot of cultural studies have been noticing the connectivity between modern culture and ancient mythology. And the basic idea here is that people think very similarly. So they use certain patterns and certain narratives to explain life reality around them. And it actually does not change too much from century to century. So if you think, people always have similar needs, like the need for recognition, the need for the savior, for someone to come and save the poor and the people that cannot protect themselves. People always have the need for sympathy, for compassion. So all of those basic human needs, you often can see them reflected in mythology, and you can often see them reflected in modern pop culture. A couple examples from ancient mythology. If you take a look at ancient Greek myths, they have a lot of heroes that sacrifice themselves or do unbelievable work to help the humanity or to help someone. So for example, Prometheus sacrificed himself to bring fire to people. So we have this superhero that did something heroic to help ordinary people. Very similar idea in an ancient Anglo-Saxon poem, Beowulf, about a hero that protected people from the dragon monster. A very similar idea of a superhero that protects ordinary people or helps them. And that was written around the 8th century. So as you can see, centuries go by, but we still see the same narrative repeating over and over. Same with ancient Russian folklore stories. There's a whole series of ancient stories about the 3 knights that protect ordinary people from the enemy. And in every story, there's a different mythological enemy, but those 3 knights always defeat the enemy to protect ordinary people. So we can sort of see that across human cultures, no matter what part of the world we're talking about, there's this similar narrative of a hero sacrificing himself or doing something unbelievably difficult to protect ordinary people, which indicates this overall human need for comfort, for protection, for safety. So overall, all those mythological plots can explain why and what we see in modern movies, for example. A lot of movies about secret agents that save the world, superheroes that save the world again. So there's a lot of similar narratives that keep repeating, and it's really strange to think about it, but a lot of those narratives repeat through the centuries.